You've probably heard of Noah's Ark, right? But long before that story ever floated around, China had its own flood myth. And it wasn't about saving animals two by two. It was about one man who tried to stop nature itself, and another who learned to work with it. They called it the Great Flood. And according to ancient Chinese legends, it lasted not for days or months, but for decades. Whole valleys drowned, mountains turned into islands, villages vanished under endless gray water. The world, they said, was ending, not with fire, but with mud. At the center of this chaos stood a man named Gun, a sort of ancient engineer appointed by the Emperor of Heaven to stop the deluge. Gun had one plan: block the water. He built massive dikes and embankments to hold the floods back. But nature doesn't like being told what to do. The waters rose higher, broke his barriers, and swept everything away. In the myth, Gun is punished by the gods for his arrogance, transformed into a creature, or killed, depending on which version you read. Either way, he failed spectacularly. But Gun had a son, Yu, and Yu didn't just inherit his father's mission. He inherited his obsession. When Gun tried to fight the water, Yu decided to understand it. He traveled for years, walking the length of China, studying how rivers moved. Instead of blocking the floods, he carved channels and canals, guiding the water safely to the sea. Legends say he worked so hard he passed his own home 3 times and never went inside because he didn't want to lose focus. His devotion impressed even the gods. And when he finally succeeded, the land was saved, the people were safe, and Yu was crowned the first ruler of the Xia dynasty, the earliest kingdom in Chinese tradition. Now, here's where the myth starts blurring into history. In 2016, geologists discovered evidence of a real catastrophic flood that hit China around 1920 BCE. A landslide dam on the Yellow River collapsed, sending a wall of water tearing through the valleys. Archaeological sites from that time show sudden destruction and rebuilding, right when the Xia supposedly began. So maybe Yu wasn't just a story. Maybe he was a memory of humanity's first engineer who learned that survival means working with nature, not against it. And that lesson shaped China's entire worldview. From emperors to farmers, from philosophy to architecture, the idea of harmony over domination became central. Yu's story isn't just about a flood. It's about balance, humility, and leadership. The Chinese still call him Yu the Great, not because he conquered the water, but because he listened to it. Ever heard someone say, "We're all made from the same stuff"? In ancient China, that wasn't a metaphor. It was taken literally. Because according to one of the oldest stories ever told, humanity began as a pottery project. Once upon a time, long before kings, palaces, or dynasties, the goddess Nuwa looked out over a quiet, empty earth. The rivers flowed, the mountains shimmered, the wind whispered through the reeds. But there was no one to appreciate it. The world was beautiful, but lonely. So she decided to start a company. She walked down to the Yellow River, scooped up a handful of its sticky golden mud, and began shaping it. A nose, a mouth, arms,
legs, each little figure coming to life as she breathed upon it. And just like that, humans existed. At first, she took her time, each one crafted by hand, shaped with care. Those people, the legend says, became the nobles, the scholars, rulers, and artisans. But Nuwa soon realized something: making billions of people one at a time was exhausting work. So she came up with a shortcut. She dipped a rope in the riverbed and snapped it through the air, sending droplets of mud flying in every direction. Each drop that hit the ground turned into a new person. These, she said, would be the common folk, farmers, workers, the everyday crowd. And just like that, class differences were born. Not from politics, not from money, but from the goddess's time management strategy. It's a funny way to explain inequality, but there's more to it than that. This story wasn't meant to insult anyone. It said something deeper. Every person, whether hand-molded or splattered, came from the same clay, the same river, the same divine breath. You could be rich or poor, but in the end, you were still mud given meaning. That idea that society has ranks, but everyone shares one origin, became a quiet heartbeat under Chinese culture for thousands of years. The myth taught harmony, not division. It was okay to have differences, as long as everything worked together like parts of a living body. And Nuwa herself, she's not just some background goddess. She's one of the oldest symbols of creation and balance in the world. Artists painted her as half woman, half dragon, a bridge between heaven and earth. Later legends even said she once repaired the sky itself, melting 5 colored stones to patch the heavens after a cosmic disaster. She didn't destroy chaos, she healed it. That's what makes her story so powerful. While Western myths often begin with punishment or sin, the Chinese origin story begins with care. A goddess crafting life because she was lonely, not angry. A divine artist who looked at a muddy river and saw potential. So if you ever feel small, remember, according to Nuwa, you're not just dust. You're yellow river clay kissed by a goddess and given a story to live in. When you think of binary code, ones, zeros, computers, you probably picture glowing screens and silicon chips, right? But what if I told you the idea behind all of that, the very logic that makes your phone, your laptop, even your AI work, was already figured out in ancient China by a guy drawing lines in the dirt? Meet Fuxi, part myth, part philosopher, part cosmic engineer. In Chinese legend, he's one of the 3 sovereigns, the culture heroes who supposedly taught humanity everything: how to fish, how to cook, how to make music. Basically, the original how-to guy of civilization. But Fuxi's most mind-bending invention wasn't fire or food. It was pattern. He looked at the sky, the rivers, the way seasons shifted, and saw that the universe kept dancing between 2 forces, light and dark, male and female, full and empty, yin and yang. So he took a brush and drew a line, a solid one for yang, then a broken one for yin. And with just those 2 symbols, 1 and 0 in spirit, he built the bagua, the 8 trigrams. Each trigram has 3 lines stacked together, 8 possible combinations: heaven, earth, thunder, water, mountain, wind, fire, lake. Every natural force, every human situation explained through a small binary pattern. When you pair 2 trigrams, you get 64 hexagrams, which became the backbone of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. Now here's where it gets crazy. Thousands of years later, in the 1600s, the German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz, the same guy credited with inventing binary math, stumbled across the I Ching. He looked at Fuqi's symbols and nearly fell off his chair. The solid line was a 1. The broken line was a 0. The 64 hexagrams? A complete 6-bit code chart. Leibniz actually wrote that the Chinese had already understood binary logic long before him. So this ancient myth suddenly became a blueprint for modern computing, logic wrapped in philosophy. But the bagua wasn't just numbers, it was a worldview. Fuqi's system wasn't about predicting the future. It was about understanding how everything changes. Yin becomes yang. Yang becomes yin. Chaos becomes order. Order collapses back to chaos. Life is a loop of code, constantly rewriting itself. That's why the I Ching was used for everything: strategy, medicine, even city planning. To ancient thinkers, you couldn't separate science from spirit, logic from nature. Fuqi didn't divide the world into zeros and ones to dominate it. He did it to understand it. And that's the beautiful irony. Modern computers use binary to simplify reality into data. Fuqi used binary to embrace reality's complexity, to show that 2 opposing forces could create infinite possibilities. So next time your screen lights up, remember, long before Silicon Valley, a mythic sage beside the Yellow River stared at the sky, drew 2 little lines, and quietly wrote the first code humanity ever used. Solid, broken, yang, yin, 1, 0, change. When you hear the word compass, you probably think of sailors steering wooden ships or explorers wandering through jungles. But China's very first compass wasn't used on the sea at all. It was used to find something far stranger than north or south. It was meant to find harmony. Legend says it all began with the Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, the mythical father of Chinese civilization. This guy's resume reads like a fantasy novel. He supposedly invented writing, medicine, music, and warfare. And somewhere between all that, he and his engineers created the world's very first magnetic device. But here's the twist. They didn't call it a compass. They called it the Sinan, the south-pointing spoon. Imagine a spoon carved from lodestone, a naturally magnetic rock, resting on a perfectly smooth bronze plate engraved with mysterious symbols. When you let go, the spoon slowly turns, and like magic, its handle points south, not north, south. Because in Chinese thought, south wasn't just a direction. It was sacred, the place of the sun, warmth, and virtue. Even emperors sat facing south when holding court, so their energy aligned with the heavens. So this spoon wasn't just telling people where to go. It was telling them how to exist. Now here's where myth and science blur in the best way. The story places the Yellow Emperor around 2600 BCE, long before anyone in the West even imagined magnetism. We can't prove the spoon existed in his time, but ancient Chinese texts from later centuries do describe versions of it in incredible detail. By the Han Dynasty, engineers had actually built them. Bronze plates with rotating magnetic spoons used for divination and geomancy, the art of reading the Earth's energy. Think of it as the world's first scientific instrument, used not for travel, but for spiritual calibration. Priests and engineers used it to orient palaces, align tombs, and even plan military formations. It wasn't about getting somewhere. It was about facing the right way in life and leadership. And the idea stuck. Over time, that simple south-pointing spoon evolved into the suspended magnetic needle, and by the Song Dynasty, Chinese sailors were using it at sea, centuries before Europeans learned the trick. In other words, the compass that eventually guided Columbus's ships began as a philosopher's toy in the court of a mythic emperor. But maybe the most beautiful part is how it was interpreted. Ancient Chinese poets used the south-pointing spoon as a metaphor for moral integrity. The wise ruler, they said, is like a compass, steady, balanced, always pointing in the right direction, no matter how the world spins. So yes, the first compass might have started as a scientific curiosity, but it ended up something deeper. A symbol that technology isn't just about control, it's about connection. Because long before magnetism guided ships across oceans, it guided minds toward something even harder to find. You know how people today spend a fortune trying to look good in life? Well, back in ancient China, the rich wanted to look good in death. And I mean literally, because some of them were buried in suits made entirely of jade. During the Han Dynasty, around 2,000 years ago, emperors and nobles believed jade wasn't just a pretty stone, it was magic. They thought it had the power to keep the body from decaying and the soul from wandering. Ancient texts claimed jade held qi, the life force itself. It could block evil spirits, purify the flesh, even bridge the mortal world and the divine. So when a powerful Han noble died, their tomb wasn't just filled with treasures. It contained something much stranger, a custom-made suit of immortality. Picture this, thousands of tiny jade rectangles, each one hand-cut, polished until smooth as glass, then drilled with tiny holes at the corners. Artisans would sit for months sewing them together with precious wire, gold for emperors, silver for princes, copper or silk thread for lesser nobles. Slowly, a human-shaped shell took form: head, arms, legs, fingers, even the face. The result looked like a glittering green exoskeleton, a mosaic of perfection meant to hold a spirit forever. When the body was placed inside and the tomb was sealed, it wasn't just burial, it was transformation. To the Han, jade represented purity and permanence. Rocks might crumble, wood might rot, but jade was eternal. And by covering the dead in it, they hoped that eternity would rub off. The first time archaeologists actually found one was in 1968, in the tomb of Prince Luseng and his wife, Dawan. When they opened the chamber, their lamps flickered over something dazzling, a full jade suit made of 2,400 plates sewn with gold wire. It fit perfectly around the prince's body, like a second skin of light. Nearby lay his wife's suit, equally stunning. The craftsmanship was so precise that some sections were still flexible after 2,000 years. And these weren't one-offs. Dozens more have been found across China, proof that for a while, immortality was an industry. But eventually, the government had to ban them. The sheer cost and time meant only the elite could afford it, and too many tombs were being looted for gold wire. By decree, jade armor was reserved strictly for royalty. Death, it seems, had class boundaries too. Still, even with all that effort, it didn't work. Bodies still decayed, dynasties still fell, and jade couldn't stop time. But the idea behind it, that you could preserve something pure beyond death, never really died. The Han didn't believe immortality was about living forever. They believed it was about lasting beautifully, even in silence, even in the dark. So somewhere beneath the soil of China, princes and princesses still lie, sealed in jade, glowing faintly in the dark, waiting for eternity to notice. There's a thin line between bravery and stupidity, and somewhere on that line walks Shennong, China's legendary divine farmer. He's the guy who looked at a poisonous plant and said, maybe I'll just eat it and find out. And somehow that risky curiosity changed the course of medicine forever. According to ancient legend, Shennong wasn't born in a palace or among warriors. He came from the earth itself. People say he had the body of a man and the head of an ox. Strong, patient, stubborn. He watched his people suffer from hunger and sickness and realized they didn't understand the land they lived on. So he decided to teach them. He taught farming, how to till the soil, plant grains, and harvest with the seasons. But there was a bigger problem. People were dying from diseases, and no one knew why. So Shennong did something insane. He decided to test every plant, root, and mushroom he could find. And he didn't just test them on others, he tested them on himself. The stories say he could taste hundreds of herbs a day, sometimes 50 before breakfast. He'd chew the leaves, watch how his body reacted, and take notes, or as close to notes as someone 5,000 years ago could manage. To make things more interesting, Shennong supposedly had a transparent stomach, so he could literally see how each plant affected him. Picture that, an ancient scientist with a see-through belly watching his organs bubble like a chemistry set. He found which plants healed fever, which eased pain, which could kill a man instantly. He discovered tea. Legend says he was boiling water under a tree when leaves blew in, and he realized the brew could cleanse the body and counteract poison. Eventually, he recorded his knowledge in a book called the Shennong Benchao Qing, the Divine Farmer's Classic of Materia Medica. It listed 365 herbs, one for every day of the year, sorted into 3 categories: the harmless tonics, the healing medicines, and the dangerous toxins. That system became the foundation of Chinese herbal medicine for over 2,000 years. But of course, tasting everything that grows on Earth isn't exactly a long-term career plan. One day, Shenong bit into a strange purple flower, said to be ganzi, a deadly weed. The moment he swallowed, fire erupted in his veins. He tried drinking tea to neutralize the poison, but it was too late. He collapsed in the fields he'd cultivated, the same soil that had fed his people, a man consumed by the knowledge he'd sought. In the end, Shenong became something bigger than a hero. He became a symbol of science before science, of the idea that truth is worth the pain it takes to find it. His story says knowledge isn't gifted from gods. It's earned from the dirt, from sweat, and sometimes from death itself. So the next time you swallow a pill or sip some herbal tea, remember, it all started with one stubborn farmer who couldn't stop tasting the world.
Every empire needs a symbol, a crown, a scepter, something that says, "I'm the chosen one." For ancient China, that symbol wasn't a crown or a throne. It was 9 bronze pots. Yeah, you heard that right. 9 pots. But not just any pots. These were said to be the 9 tripods of Shah, forged by Yu the Great, the legendary hero who tamed the Great Flood and founded China's first dynasty around 2000 BCE. According to legend, Yu didn't just stop floods. He built the blueprint for civilization. When he unified the 9 regions of his new empire, he ordered a set of sacred bronze tripods to be cast, one for each province. The tripods were engraved with the images of animals, mountains, and spirits that represented each region's essence. They were massive, heavy, and holy, vessels meant to hold the power of heaven and earth. But here's the thing. They weren't cooking pots or ritual urns. They were symbols of legitimacy. Whoever owned the 9 tripods ruled with the mandate of heaven, divine approval to govern all under heaven. In other words, they were the original Chinese crown jewels and maybe something even more powerful. For centuries, the tripods passed from one dynasty to another, Shah, Shang, Zhou, always treated like living relics of authority. Kings would perform sacred ceremonies around them. They weren't just proof of power. They were power. Then, sometime around the 3rd century BCE, they disappeared, vanished. No record, no recovery. Some said they were lost in war, others that they sunk under the Sai River when a desperate king tried to hide them from invaders. Others whispered that heaven itself reclaimed them, that when virtue left the rulers of China, the sacred cauldron simply left too. From that day on, everyone wanted them. Ambitious warlords would claim, "I have the tripods," or "I found one," just to strengthen their claim to the throne. It was ancient propaganda at its finest. In fact, the old idiom, "to ask about the tripods," became a poetic way of saying someone was plotting for the throne. So even when the actual bronze was gone, the idea still ruled the empire. Modern historians and archaeologists have found early bronze cauldrons from the Shang and Zhou dynasties, ceremonial, beautifully cast, massive, but none matched the legendary 9. Some scholars think the tripods were symbolic all along, a metaphor for unity and legitimacy. Others believe they were real and simply lost to time. Either way, their power was undeniable. The 9 tripods weren't just objects, they were a myth, so strong that it shaped political reality for over 2,000 years. So next time you hear about divine right or heaven's mandate, remember, in ancient China, that power wasn't written on a scroll or sealed in a crown. It was hidden inside 9 bronze cauldrons that no one's seen for millennia. Proof that sometimes the greatest treasures of an empire are the ones it can only imagine. Picture this. It's night, about 3,000 years ago. You're standing in the royal court of the Shang dynasty, and the room smells like smoke and bone. At the center, a diviner kneels before a glowing fire. He's holding what looks like a turtle shell, carved with strange symbols. The king asks his question, "Will it rain tomorrow? Will we win the battle? Will the queen's child be a boy?" And the diviner places the shell over the flame. Crack. The bone splits. The priest studies the pattern. The gods have answered. He carves the reply beside the question, forever preserving it in the shell. And just like that, the first chapter of Chinese writing begins, born not from poetry or politics, but from fire and fear. These objects are called oracle bones, pieces of turtle shell or ox scapula used for divination during the Shang dynasty around 1200 BCE. They weren't just magical tools, they were the earliest archives of an empire. The inscriptions on them, known as Jiagu Wen, are the earliest known form of Chinese script and the ancestors of every Chinese character still written today. Each done was a conversation between humans and the heavens. You can still read them today. In the next 10 days, will rain come? Will the crops grow? Should we attack the neighboring tribe? Some even recorded the outcome afterward, whether the prediction was right or wrong. It's astonishing. These ancient priests were basically running data tracking for divine communication. For centuries, though, no one knew they existed. In the 1800s, farmers near the city of Anyang were digging up old bones and selling them to apothecaries as dragon bones, ground into powder as traditional medicine. It wasn't until a scholar noticed faint carvings on them that anyone realized these weren't just bones, they were history. Archaeologists rushed to the site and uncovered more than 150,000 fragments, whole libraries of questions to the gods. Over 4,000 unique characters have been identified on them, and what's wild is that about 20% of them are still undeciphered. Some could represent forgotten animals, regional dialects, or deities whose names never made it past the Shang collapse. Even with modern AI, linguists are still trying to decode them, meaning part of the Shang language is still whispering secrets we can't yet hear. The oracle bones changed everything we thought we knew about ancient China. They proved the Shang dynasty was real, not just a myth. They recorded eclipses, wars, weather, childbirths, and royal sacrifices, the earliest bureaucracy, the earliest science, the earliest written curiosity. And the most poetic part? Writing itself was born from people desperate for certainty. They didn't write poems or laws first. They wrote questions. So the next time you glance at Chinese characters, those graceful, ancient lines, remember they began as cracks in bone, read by firelight. Every word today, every message sent,
traces its lineage back to a time when humanity asked the universe a question, and the universe answered by breaking. If you ever find yourself in an old Chinese town just before dawn, when the streetlights flicker and the air feels colder than it should, you might stumble into a place locals call the Ghost Market. It's quiet, but alive. Tables appear out of nowhere. Vendors set down lanterns and start arranging their wares. Old coins, paper talismans, dusty jade pendants, maybe even a porcelain doll missing an eye. They sell fast, whispering prices. No one asks too many questions. And then, as the sun rises, the market vanishes as suddenly as it appeared. The idea goes back over 3,000 years to the Zhou dynasty. In those days, people believed that when night fell, the boundary between worlds grew thin. Yin energy filled the air, and spirits wandered freely. According to early legends, there was a market that opened only then, where the living and the dead could trade. People would leave bowls of rice, tiny paper houses, or silk garments on makeshift stalls, hoping wandering ancestors would take what they needed. In return, the spirits might bless their family, cure an illness, or simply leave them alone for another year. It sounds eerie, but to Zhou-era people it was practical. If you owed a debt to a relative who died, you could pay it off in the ghost market. If you wanted luck for your harvest, you could buy it by burning paper coins. It was half ritual, half commerce, a spiritual economy. Over time, the idea caught fire, literally. During Ghost Month, entire towns lit lanterns and filled streets with offerings. Merchants realized spirits weren't the only ones spending, so they joined in, selling incense, paper effigies, and charms. What began as worship slowly turned into business. The night itself became a marketplace. By the Tang and Song dynasties, big cities like Kaifeng and Chang'an had real night markets called ghost markets. They stayed open until sunrise, packed with food stalls, storytellers, and performers. People joked that ghosts shopped there because only the dead didn't need sleep. But deep down, everyone felt that old superstition lingering, that somewhere between the drunks, the gamblers, and the lantern smoke, unseen customers were still wandering through. Even the language survived. In later dynasties, ghost market became slang for secret or black market trade, a deal done in shadows. And today, you can still find them. In places like Beijing, Xi'an, and Taipei, antique dealers open stalls at 3 in the morning. They say the best treasures show up before dawn, when honest folk are asleep, and spirits still remember the way home. So maybe the ghost market never really disappeared. It just changed shifts. What started as a ritual for the dead became a tradition for the living. A reminder that commerce, like belief, never truly dies. Next time you pass a stall glowing under a weak streetlight and feel a chill down your neck, don't worry. It's probably just a breeze. Or maybe someone still haggling for incense. Every ruler loves to say they were chosen by the gods. The clever ones, though, they make sure the gods can fire them, too. That's exactly what the Zhou dynasty did more than 3,000 years ago when they overthrew the powerful Shang. After the war was won, the new rulers faced a serious PR problem. The Shang had claimed divine blood. Their kings were sons of heaven. So how could the Zhou justify rebellion against people who supposedly ruled by heaven's command? Their answer was genius. Heaven, changed its mind. They called it the Mandate of Heaven, Tian Ming. The idea was simple, but revolutionary. Heaven, they said, gives you the right to rule, but only as long as you rule well. Be wise, just, and virtuous, and the cosmos itself will back you. But become corrupt, neglect the people, ignore the rituals, and heaven will send signs, droughts, earthquakes, rebellions, meteors, floods. If those warnings are ignored, heaven will revoke the mandate, and anyone who topples you is justified. It was divine right with a built-in recall button. To Zhao, heaven wasn't a bearded god in the clouds, it was the moral pulse of the universe. If the kingdom was out of balance, heaven would show it through chaos. The king's job was to listen. Rule in harmony, and nature itself would cooperate. Rains would come, harvests would thrive, the people would sing your name. Rule selfishly, and even the wind would turn against you. That idea flipped ancient politics on its head. Every dynasty that followed, Qin, Han, Tang, and Song, all claimed to have seized power because the previous rulers lost the mandate. Each collapse was blamed on moral failure, not luck or stronger armies. When peasants rebelled, they weren't traitors, they were heaven's correction. Historians eventually noticed the pattern and named it the dynastic cycle. Virtue brings rise, greed brings fall, and the wheel turns again. It's strange how practical this cosmic theory turned out to be. It created a sense of political accountability centuries before Europeans even debated it. The mandate of heaven said rulers didn't own their people. They served them on heaven's behalf. If they failed, rebellion wasn't a sin. It was sacred maintenance. Even today, echoes of it remain. When modern Chinese leaders talk about harmony between heaven and humankind, they're echoing that same ancient contract. Power exists only while it benefits the people. So in the end, the mandate of heaven wasn't really about gods choosing kings. It was about reminding kings that even the gods could choose again. Heaven, in the Zhao view, wasn't a promise. It was a performance review. And every ruler, no matter how divine they claimed to be, eventually got the same cosmic note in the margins. Improve governance, or we'll find someone else. Picture a world where keeping quiet could get you killed. In ancient China's state of Qin, even if your neighbor stole a chicken and you didn't report it, the executioner might come for you too. That wasn't chaos, that was the law. Welcome to the world of Shang Yang, the man who turned fear into a government system. During the 4th century BCE, China was split into warring states, constant battles, broken treaties, and nobles who acted like kings. Qin, tucked away in the rugged west, was poor and backward. Everyone mocked them as barbarians. Then along came Shang Yang, a political thinker who looked at the mess and said, "Virtue won't save us, fear will." He built a philosophy called legalism. Forget Confucius's rule by morality. Shang Yang believed humans were selfish, lazy, and short-sighted. The only thing that kept them honest was punishment. So he rewrote everything. Laws were carved in public for everyone to read, no excuses. Punishments were harsh and absolute. Nobles and peasants whipped, branded, or executed alike. Families were grouped into mutual responsibility units. If one person broke the law, everyone paid. Failed to report your friend's crime, you became a criminal too. He even made people spy on each other. Loyalty to the state came before loyalty to family. Farmers and soldiers were rewarded. Scholars and merchants were treated like parasites. The idea was simple: grow food, fight wars, obey orders. Anything else was a distraction. And horrifyingly, it worked. Under Xiangyang's system, Qin became efficient, disciplined, and unstoppable. Taxes poured in, crops grew, the army swelled. Other states collapsed under Qin's precision. By 221 BCE, Qin's ruler, Qin Shi Huang, unified China for the first time, crowning himself first emperor. Behind that victory stood the cold machinery of legalism. But there was a cost. Ordinary people lived in terror. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. If your plow broke and you missed a harvest quota, you might lose a hand. Children informed parents. Even laughter could be suspicious. Qin had built the most powerful empire in Asia, and also the loneliest. Ironically, Xiangyang himself was destroyed by his own creation. When the duke who protected him died, his enemies accused him of treason. He tried to flee, but was recognized at an inn. The law required hosts to report all travelers without documents. He'd written that law. They caught him, and he was executed, torn apart by horses, precisely as the code demanded. Yet legalism didn't die with him. Its fingerprints are everywhere in Chinese history, in centralized bureaucracy, standardized laws, and the belief that order matters more than mercy. Xiangyang proved that discipline can build empires. He also proved it can break them. Qin's dynasty lasted only 15 years before rebellion tore it down. The people were so crushed by fear that when the first crack appeared, the whole machine exploded. So yes, legalism unified China, but it did it the way a blacksmith shapes iron, by fire and hammer, until everything softer was gone.
When you hear Renaissance genius, you probably think of Leonardo da Vinci. The sketches, the flying machines, the beautiful chaos of art meeting science. But almost 2,000 years before Leonardo ever picked up a quill, an ancient Chinese philosopher named Mozi was already designing machines that could save cities, not destroy them. Mozi lived during the Warring States period, around the 5th century BCE, when China was a patchwork of kingdoms, constantly at war. While most thinkers of his time were busy writing about kings and rituals, Mozi was busy building things. He wasn't born rich or noble. He was a craftsman, the kind of man who understood ropes and pulleys and wood grain. But his mind worked like an engineer's blueprint crossed with a monk's heart. He preached universal love, that heaven cared for all people equally, and that wars of conquest were crimes against the divine order. Still, Mozi wasn't naive. He knew that idealism alone wouldn't stop an invading army. So he turned philosophy into engineering. If rulers wouldn't stop attacking the weak, then he would make sure the weak could survive. His followers, the Moists, became China's first team of military engineers. They built machines that sound straight out of a Da Vinci notebook,
giant crossbows that fired volleys, counterweight catapults, rotating shields, pulley-driven traps, and clever mechanical doors that could block battering rams. Their mission wasn't conquest, it was defense through intelligence. One of the most famous stories tells of a small kingdom called Song, about to be invaded by the powerful state of Chu. Mosey heard about it and traveled hundreds of miles to meet the king. When he arrived, Chu's engineers were showing off their siege weapons, towering ladders, rams, and catapults. Mosey smiled and said, "Let's test them." For every weapon they demonstrated, he had already built a counter. When they used ladders, he unveiled hooks that tore them down. When they rolled battering rams, he showed sliding gates that absorbed the blow. When they fired stones, he revealed spring-loaded shields. He predicted every move like he could see the future. Finally, the king of Chu gave up. He hadn't lost a battle. He'd lost to pure logic. The invasion was canceled. No blood spilled, just the power of design and reason. Mosey's followers documented all this in the Mosey text, chapters filled with diagrams and formulas describing mechanical principles. Sadly, most of those writings were lost over time, but the fragments that survive are astonishingly advanced, centuries ahead of Greek physics and nearly 1,800 years before Da Vinci's machines. The irony is almost poetic. The man who despised war became famous for building weapons. But in Mosey's mind, that wasn't hypocrisy. It was compassion made practical. He wasn't arming kings to kill. He was teaching them how not to fight. So when we call Leonardo a genius, remember there was once a Chinese craftsman philosopher who built peace out of gears and wood. His name was Mosey, and his machines didn't conquer the world. They protected it.
Picture this: glowing furnaces, molten metal pouring into molds, sparks flying into the night. Not a modern factory, but an empire in the making. Long before anyone invented the word industry, the ancient state of Qin had already figured out a secret every empire would later copy. If you control the iron, you control the world. In the 3rd century BCE, China was still a patchwork of rival kingdoms. Ironworking was spreading fast. It was the technology of its age. Iron made stronger swords, tougher plows, better tools. But there was one huge problem. Anyone with an iron furnace could make weapons. Local nobles, warlords, even rich farmers could arm their followers and threaten the state. For the rulers of Qin, that was unacceptable. Enter Han Fei, a legalist philosopher with a mind as sharp as a sword. He believed people couldn't be trusted, not nobles, not merchants, not even scholars. Only the law should have power. So he came up with an idea that sounds strangely modern. The government should own and control all key industries, especially iron. The plan was as brilliant as it was ruthless. Private smelters were outlawed. Foundries were taken over by the state. Massive government workshops sprang up near ore-rich mountains, guarded by soldiers and run by bureaucrats. Every ingot of iron had to be registered, every blade accounted for. No one could make a hoe, a sword, or a spear without government approval.
This wasn't just about weapons. It was about power through standardization. By centralizing iron production, the Qin could regulate who got what. Farmers received plows, soldiers received swords, rebels received nothing. Even farming tools were monitored, because too many hoes might mean a militia in disguise. The system worked. Within decades, Qin's army became the best equipped in China. Their weapons were uniform, their supply lines efficient, their armor mass-produced in state-run factories. While other kingdoms squabbled and forged unevenly, Qin marched in perfect sync, a mechanical empire forged by law and iron. But there was a dark side. Freedom vanished from the forge. Artisans became civil servants. Innovation slowed. The same rigid discipline that made Qin unbeatable also made it brittle. Still, when Qin finally unified China in 221 BCE, it was steel and bureaucracy, not poetry or faith, that held the empire together. The influence didn't stop there. Later dynasties copied the idea, monopolizing salt, iron, and alcohol to fill state coffers. By the Han Dynasty, ministers were debating in court whether these monopolies were moral. The legalists had won. The state's strength mattered more than anyone's comfort. Han Fei's iron monopoly was more than an economic policy. It was a revelation. He turned the forge into a political machine, a symbol that control could be as powerful as creativity. So when we talk about the first industrial revolution, maybe it didn't start with steam or steel mills. Maybe it started here, in ancient Qin, with molten iron, state inspectors, and one philosopher who realized that the sharpest weapon isn't a sword, it's control.
He wasn't a warrior, he was a farmer. But when he pulled that bronze trigger, he could kill a noble from 100 paces away. That was the terror of the crossbow, the machine that changed China and eventually the world. Long before gunpowder or rifles, battles in ancient China were elegant, almost ceremonial. Armies were led by nobles in chariots. Archers trained for years to master the perfect draw, and war was as much about prestige as it was about strategy. The average farmer stood no chance. Then, sometime around the 5th century BCE, someone had an idea so simple it was almost cheating. What if you could build a bow that aimed itself? That's where the crossbow was born, the first true mechanical weapon in human history. Instead of muscle strength and endless practice, this thing used engineering. A short bow mounted on a wooden stock, drawn with a crank or lever and locked into place by a bronze trigger mechanism. When you squeezed the trigger, the string snapped forward with precision every single time. You didn't need years of elite training, just one steady hand. For rulers like those of Qin and Han, this was revolutionary. A weapon that turned commoners into sharpshooters meant one thing: the state, not the aristocracy, now held the monopoly on skill and death. Thousands of peasants could be armed, drilled, and replaced. The battlefield stopped being a duel between heroes and became a chessboard of units firing in a deadly rhythm. Archaeologists have found these bronze triggers perfectly preserved, stamped with the marks of their factories. Some still work. Each component was standardized and interchangeable, a concept we wouldn't see again until the gun factories of the 19th century. 2,000 years before modern manufacturing, the Qin were already using serial numbers for quality control. And they didn't just make one or two, they made tens of thousands. When Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, his soldiers marched with crossbows so consistent that they could swap parts between them. It was the first industrial army on Earth. The crossbow was more than a weapon. It was a social earthquake. It erased the old aristocratic idea that only the noble-born could fight with honor. Now, a farmer with calloused hands could kill a general in gilded armor. Technology had leveled the battlefield. But it also made war colder, more mechanical, more efficient. The same weapon that gave power to the peasant also made killing impersonal. You didn't need courage, just coordination. Still, this was the moment China entered the age of mass warfare and mass production, not through steam or steel, but through string and bronze. The crossbow took war out of the hands of heroes and gave it to the system. A perfect weapon for an empire built on discipline and precision. So yes, Leonardo drew flying machines, but the Chinese, 1,800 years earlier, built something far more dangerous, a trigger that could turn ordinary men into history's first army of machines.
They said he'd never walk again. They were right, but they forgot to mention he'd still win wars. This is the story of Sun Bin, a crippled genius who beat his enemies not with armies, but with arithmetic. Sun Bin lived during the Warring States period, around the 4th century BCE, an age when every kingdom in China was fighting every other kingdom, and strategy was worth more than gold. He was a descendant, or perhaps a disciple, of Sun Tzu, the man who wrote The Art of War. But where Sun Tzu wrote philosophy, Sun Bin lived the experiment. He studied alongside another young strategist named Pang Huan. They were both brilliant, but Pang was jealous. When their careers took off, Pang betrayed him, framing him for treason. The punishment was cruel, even by ancient standards. They tattooed his face, shattered his kneecaps, and exiled him. He could never ride a horse or lead troops again. So he did something no one expected. He learned how to fight without moving. From his exile, Sun Bin began to calculate. He measured how far an army could march before exhaustion set in, how much food a soldier could carry, how long morale would last under heat and hunger. He treated war like geometry, all angles, timing, and human error. He realized something profound. The most predictable part of war wasn't weather or terrain, it was pride. Years later, fate brought him face to face with his old rival Pang Huan once more, this time across a battlefield. The state of Wei, led by Pang, invaded the state of Qi, where Sun Bin now served as an advisor. The crippled strategist couldn't march, but he could think, and thinking was deadlier. He told Qi's generals to retreat, slowly, deliberately, leaving fewer cooking fires each night. The first night, there were 100,000 fires. Then 50,000, then only 30,000. When Pang's scouts reported this, he laughed. "Half their army's deserted," he said. "We've won." So he charged ahead with his elite troops, leaving his main force behind. That's when Sun Bin's trap snapped shut.
He lured Pang into a narrow valley called Maling, where the cliffs funneled his soldiers into a perfect killing ground. On one tree at the center of the pass, Sun Bin had carved a message: "Hang Huan dies beneath this tree." When Pang rode in at dusk, torches lit up, thousands of them. Qi's archers loosed volleys from both sides, and Hui's elite troops were shredded in minutes. Pang, realizing the irony, took his own life beneath that tree. Sun Bin's revenge was precise to the decimal. Historians call it the first mathematically designed battle in history. Sun Bin proved that war could be won through data, timing, and psychology, a victory not of strength, but of calculation. He never needed legs to walk. He just needed numbers to make the world move for him.
In 1965, deep in the damp earth of a forgotten tomb, a team of Chinese archaeologists brushed away silk wrappings and froze. There, lying beside a skeleton in a waterlogged coffin, was a sword, gleaming, not rusted, not corroded, gleaming. They lifted it gently into the light, expecting it to crumble. Instead, it reflected their faces like a mirror. 2,500 years underground, and the blade of King Gaozhan of Yue still shone like the day it was forged. The find shocked the world. This wasn't some mythic relic from a legend. It was a real weapon from the spring and autumn period, around 500 BCE. When conservators tested it, it still cut paper cleanly, a perfect edge, sharp as truth. No one could believe it. Bronze rusts, time eats everything. So how was this blade untouched? To answer that, we need to know its owner. Gaozhan, the king of Yue, was a ruler who knew defeat better than most. He once lost his kingdom to the state of Wu, and to survive, he served as a slave in the enemy's palace. He scrubbed floors. He bowed to his conqueror. He tasted humiliation every day and stored it like a weapon. When he finally returned home, he rebuilt his army, sharpened his will, and after years of patience, crushed his enemies. His story became one of China's most famous lessons in endurance. Sleep on brushwood, taste gall, they say. Always remember your bitterness until you take back what's yours. And maybe that's why his sword endures too. It's more than metal, it's metaphor. But even metaphor can't explain chemistry. So scientists examined it. They found the blade was made from a near-perfect alloy of copper, tin, lead, and sulfur, balanced so precisely that it resisted oxidation. On top of that, the sword had a microscopic coating of chromium oxide, a corrosion-proof layer centuries ahead of its time, essentially ancient stainless bronze. No one knows exactly how artisans achieved it. Whether by accident or design, it was metallurgy that shouldn't have existed for another 2 millennia. The sword itself is exquisite, about 2 feet long, patterned with diamond-shaped etchings that shimmer in light. The hilt is wrapped in dark silk, capped with turquoise and blue crystals. Even the inscriptions are perfect. Made for the king of Yue, Gaozhan, who stands against hardship. It's not a weapon of war. It's a declaration of immortality. Today, the sword of Gaozhan rests in the Hubei Provincial Museum, sealed behind glass, still shining under artificial light as it once did under the sun of ancient Yue. It hasn't tarnished. It hasn't dulled. It's as if the man's unbreakable patience was forged into the blade itself. Every so often, scientists return to test it again, searching for the secret that time forgot. And every time, the sword gives them the same silent answer, that some things are built to outlast even history.
2,000 years ago, China held what was basically the world's first televised economic debate. Except there were no cameras, just scrolls, silk robes, and an emperor who wanted to know, should the government run the economy or should the people? It happened in 81 BCE during the Han Dynasty, in a grand marble hall filled with officials and scholars. The empire had just come out of decades of war under Emperor Wu. Great victories, yes, but also massive spending. To pay for it all, the government had taken over production of salt, iron, and alcohol, turning them into state monopolies. Every tool, every bar of metal, every grain of salt passed through imperial hands. At first, it worked. The treasury filled. Roads, walls, and armies flourished. But after Emperor Wu died, his successors began to question if the empire was losing its soul. So Emperor Zhao ordered a public hearing, something revolutionary for its time. Officials, scholars, and merchants were invited to argue openly about how the empire should run. On one side were the legalist bureaucrats, practical, loyal to the state. They argued the empire's safety depends on control. If we let merchants run free, they'll exploit the people. The state must manage production to protect everyone and to fund the army. On the other side were the Confucian reformers, idealists in scholars' robes. They countered, people don't need control, they need virtue. The monopolies make officials greedy and peasants poor. A good government teaches morality, not business. And then it began, the first true economic debate in recorded history. For days, voices echoed through the chamber as they argued over philosophy, profit, and fairness. The bureaucrats waved ledgers and maps, talking about metal output and border defenses. The scholars quoted Confucius, warning that the state's obsession with wealth corrupted its virtue. One even asked, if the emperor profits like a merchant, who will guide the people to righteousness? It was the ancient world's version of capitalism versus socialism, efficiency versus ethics, a timeless tug-of-war. In the end, the state kept its monopolies. The administrators won on paper. After all, the army still needed iron and the empire still needed salt. But history remembers the scholars, because for the first time a government had invited open policy debate, not decrees, not punishments, but words. And those words survived. The transcript, called the Yan Telun, Discussions on Salt and Iron, still exists today. Reading it feels uncanny. They talk about corruption, inflation, the burden on the poor, and the dangers of privatization. The same topics economists argue over now. The Han didn't find a perfect answer. No one ever has. But they did something new. They treated economics as ethics. They asked not just what works, but what's right. So the next time you hear a modern debate about free markets or state control, remember, 2,000 years ago, in a candlelit hall in Han, China, the same arguments were already raging, and the salt was just as salty.
You've seen the terracotta army, endless gray soldiers standing in silent formation beneath Xi'an soil. But what if I told you they weren't gray at all? When the first warriors were unearthed in 1974, the archaeologists froze, because staring back at them from the clay wasn't dull stone, it was color. Flesh-toned faces, crimson armor, black hair slicked with lacquer, bright purples and turquoise swirling across shoulder plates. For a moment, the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, came alive, an entire army glowing in the dim light of 2,000 years. Then, just minutes later, it was gone. As the oxygen hit, the paint began to bubble and peel. The lacquer layer beneath it curled like burning paper, flaking off into dust. Within hours, all that vivid color, those purples, blues, and reds had vanished. The first and last glimpse of China's true rainbow army disappeared almost as soon as it was seen. To understand why this mattered, you need to know what these colors represented. Each of the 8,000 terracotta soldiers was made to guard Qin Shi Huang in the afterlife. Every single one was unique, not a single face repeated. Their armor, uniforms, and hairstyles marked their rank and division, just like real soldiers. The pigments were created from rare minerals and incredible chemistry. Azurite for blue, malachite for green, cinnabar for red, and a pigment scientists still marvel at, Chinese purple, a synthetic compound never found anywhere else in the ancient world. Even the Greeks and Romans couldn't make it. It's the first known example of a man-made color, chemistry born from empire. The artisans of the Qin didn't just sculpt soldiers, they painted life into them. They mixed realism with divine power, the emperor's private army glowing like dawn itself, meant to protect him forever. But forever didn't last long once we found it. In 1974, the excavation was done quickly. No one expected fragile pigments that had survived under airtight conditions for over 2 millennia. The moment those warriors touched air, humidity and oxygen destroyed the lacquer instantly. Archaeologists watched helplessly as irreplaceable paint crumbled before their eyes, a tragedy in real time. Since then, scientists have learned their lesson. Now, when new figures are discovered, they stay buried until preservation technology catches up. Some are excavated inside sealed chambers where temperature, light, and oxygen are carefully controlled. Others are digitally scanned and reconstructed using spectral imaging, recreating the soldiers' true colors on computer screens, even if we can't restore them in reality. The terracotta army you see today may be gray, but that's only a shadow of what once was, a ghost of color. Under the first emperor's tomb, there was once an ocean of light. Red soldiers, violet generals, green chariots gleaming in torchlight. It's strange. We call them terracotta warriors, but they were never made to look like clay. They were made to look alive. And maybe that's why they had to fade, because the dead don't keep their color for long once we disturb their sleep.
He was supposed to find an ally. Instead, he found the rest of the world. In 1380 BCE, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty summoned a court officer named Zhang Chan and gave him an impossible mission: travel west through the deserts and mountains beyond China's frontier to find the Yuezhi, a nomadic people who might help fight the empire's greatest enemy, the Xiannu. It was the kind of order you couldn't refuse, and almost no one survived. Zhang Chan gathered about 100 men and set out from the edge of the Great Wall. The landscape turned alien fast. Endless sand, biting wind, and no one friendly for hundreds of miles. Then, before they could even reach the Yuezhi, the Xiannu ambushed them. The entire group was captured. For most envoys, that would have been the end. But for Zhang Chan, it was only the beginning of a 13-year detour that would accidentally open the Silk Road. He spent 10 years in captivity. The Xiannu didn't kill him, they absorbed him. He learned their language, their customs, even married a Xiannu woman and had a child. He was a prisoner, but also an observer, quietly memorizing routes, rivers, and rumors of lands farther west. When he finally escaped, he didn't go home. He finished the job. Crossing deserts and mountain passes with a few surviving followers, he reached the Yuezhi, who by then had moved near the Oxus River, modern Uzbekistan. He offered Emperor Wu's proposal for alliance. They politely declined. They'd settled into peace and wealth and wanted no part in another war. But what Zhang Chan saw there changed everything. He saw horses of Fergana, huge, muscular animals that outclassed anything in China. He saw new fruits like grapes and alfalfa, textiles woven from strange fibers, and coins stamped with foreign kings. He realized China wasn't alone. It was part of a network of nations stretching west to the edge of the world, and that world was connected by trade. On his way home, he was captured again, escaped again, and finally stumbled back to China after 13 years, looking like a ghost, but carrying stories that would reshape an empire. He told Emperor Wu about lands of silk and spice, glass and gold, cities with markets full of wonders. He drew maps, described routes, and for the first time in history, China looked beyond its borders and saw opportunity. Soon, caravans began following his path: silk east to west, gold and horses west to east. The road he'd suffered on became the most famous trade route in the world, the Silk Road. Zhang Chan never meant to start globalization. He just wanted to finish a mission. But through capture, patience, and sheer survival, he gave humanity its first real bridge between civilizations. Sometimes history isn't built by those who win wars. It's built by the man who refuses to stop walking, even when the road disappears. When people imagine the Great Wall of China, they see a ribbon of stone winding over mountains, tall towers, arched gates, and centuries of strength baked into every brick. But the first Great Wall didn't look like that. It wasn't made of stone. It was made of dirt. 2,000 years before those majestic battlements rose, the first versions of the wall were built from rammed earth, layers of mud, sand, and straw pounded into wooden molds by thousands of peasants and prisoners. From a distance, it didn't look impressive. Just a long, dusty ridge stretching across the horizon. But to the people who built it and the enemies who saw it, it meant something enormous: the edge of civilization. During the Warring States period,
Long before China was one empire, each kingdom built its own border walls. The state of Qin, the state of Zhao, the state of Yan, all of them tried to carve out safety from the chaos of war and nomadic raids. When Qin Shi Huang finally unified the realm in 221 BCE, he ordered these fragments connected, forming the first continuous wall in Chinese history. Not a monument of unity yet, but a chain of survival. The construction method was brutal, but brilliant. Teams of laborers mixed soil with straw, tamping it down layer by layer until it hardened like ancient concrete. In dry northern climates, it could last for centuries. And in remote places, those earth walls are still standing today, wind-scored but defiant after 2,000 years. But here's the thing. The first Great Wall wasn't really built to stop anyone. It was too short, too thin, too uneven to hold off a determined army. It wasn't a fortress. It was a statement. A line in the sand that said, "This is China. Beyond this, you are not." It was psychological architecture, more about showing power than wielding it. Nomads might ride around it, but they'd know exactly where the emperor's world ended. The wall told a story of control, even if that control was partly an illusion. Of course, the price was horrifying. Tens of thousands died building it. Soldiers, farmers, criminals, and anyone the empire could spare. Their bones are said to rest inside the wall itself, mixed into the earth they shaped. An ancient historian once wrote, "For every span of the wall, a man was buried beneath." So, when we call it a monument, we're not wrong. It's just also a tomb. Centuries later, during the Ming Dynasty, those old clay ridges were rebuilt into the stone fortress we see today, brick by brick, tower by tower. The world remembers that wall as eternal, but the truth is, its foundations were humble, fragile, and made from the same ground it claimed to defend. The Great Wall began not as a masterpiece of stone, but as a scar of mud, a human line drawn against fear, a symbol that even when power can't protect you, it can still pretend to. It's strange to think that one of humanity's greatest inventions started with trash. In the year 105 CE, during the Han Dynasty, a court official named Kai Lun stood over a vat filled with what looked like junk, mulberry bark, hemp scraps, old rags, and worn-out fishing nets. He stirred it, mashed it, boiled it, strained it, and let it dry in the sun. When it hardened, what he held wasn't cloth, and it wasn't wood. It was paper, soft, light, and strong enough to hold ink. Before Kai Lun, writing was a luxury. Chinese scribes used bamboo slips for documents, long, heavy strips tied together with cords. Imagine trying to carry a single book made of wood. Then there was silk, smooth and elegant, but too expensive for anything except royal decrees. A library was a burden. A scroll was a privilege. Kai Lun's idea changed all that. And he wasn't a scholar or poet. He was an imperial eunuch, a practical man who managed supplies at the emperor's court. He saw waste everywhere, discarded bark, torn nets, rags no one could wear again. To most, they were garbage. To him, They were fibers, raw material waiting for a purpose. He boiled them until they softened into a gray pulp, poured that slurry over a fine mesh screen, and let the water drain. What remained was a thin, fibrous sheet that dried into something miraculous, flexible, writable, and, most importantly, cheap. It was durable enough for daily use, but light enough to carry 100 pages in your sleeve. And just like that, China's bureaucracy, literature, and memory became weightless. For the first time in history, information could spread faster than footsteps. Government clerks could record taxes, scholars could copy texts, and poets could scribble lines wherever they went. Art became portable, education accessible, and unlike stone or wood, paper could travel. Fold it, seal it, send it across an empire. What's more, Kai Lun's process was 2,000 years ahead of modern recycling. He wasn't cutting down forests, he was reusing what the world had thrown away. Old clothes, old rope, old bark. He turned refuse into remembrance. When Emperor He of Han saw the invention, he rewarded Kai Lun with wealth and honor. But history rewarded him with something bigger, immortality. Because from that vat of pulp came the blueprint for every written civilization that followed. Paper traveled west along the Silk Road to Korea, Japan, Samarkand, and eventually to the Arab world, where artisans refined it. By the 12th century, Europe was using it to make books. By the 15th, it fueled the printing press. And by the 21st, even our digital documents still borrow its shape, the humble page. Kai Lun didn't just invent a material. He invented a medium, a way for humanity to talk to itself across time. From bark and rags and fishnets came a miracle of memory, proving that sometimes the future isn't forged in metal or stone, but pressed gently from pulp and patience. It looked like something out of a legend, a massive bronze jar covered in dragons. Each dragon held a metal ball in its mouth, and beneath each one crouched a bronze toad, mouth wide open, as if waiting to catch it. In the year 132 CE, this strange object sat quietly in the palace of China's Eastern Han Dynasty, built by a scholar named Zhang Heng. Then, one day, one of the dragons opened its mouth and dropped its ball. A metallic clink echoed through the court. Everyone turned to stare. The ball had fallen from the dragon facing west. But no one in the capital felt a thing. The ground was calm, the air still. Officials laughed. "Your toy is broken," they said. Zhang Heng said nothing. He simply bowed. Days later, a messenger arrived from the west, breathless, dusty, terrified. A powerful earthquake had struck far beyond the capital. The bronze jar was right. It wasn't a legend, it was science. Zhang Heng was an astronomer, engineer, poet, and dreamer, one of those rare minds who could turn philosophy into machinery. He believed the earth was alive, full of qi, and that earthquakes were its way of shifting balance, not divine punishment, but a natural pulse. So he built something that could listen to that pulse. The device was called a haofeng di dong yi, instrument for measuring the shaking of the earth and the movement of wind. Inside that bronze jar was a pendulum, delicately balanced in the center.
When seismic waves reach the capital, even from hundreds of kilometers away, the pendulum shifted ever so slightly. That movement triggered a lever, and one of the 8 dragons released its bronze ball into the waiting toad's mouth, pointing toward the direction of the quake. It didn't measure how strong the quake was, only where it came from. But for 132 CE, that was revolutionary. It made Zhang Heng the father of seismology nearly 2,000 years before modern instruments were invented. Imagine being an official in that palace, watching a dragon spit out a bronze marble, then weeks later learning it had predicted disaster far away. No magic, no myth, just quiet engineering and an understanding that the earth has patterns if you know how to watch. Modern scientists have tried to reconstruct Zhang Heng's design. Several versions actually work, using suspended pendulums, directional levers, and weight-triggered mechanisms. It's as elegant as it is brilliant, a perfect marriage of art and physics. To the ancient Chinese, the dragons weren't decoration. They were symbols of cosmic order, power under control. Zhang Heng's device turned that symbol into reality. A world once ruled by superstition, now tamed by measurement. The original instrument is long lost, but its idea never vanished. It whispered through time, shaping everything from modern seismographers to planetary sensors. And it all began with a sound, the soft clink of a bronze ball falling into a toad's mouth, telling an empire that the earth had spoken. It began with a flicker of fire beneath paper, and then, against all logic, the paper began to rise. Long before airplanes, before science could explain lift or pressure, the ancient Chinese had already learned how to make air carry their messages. They called them sky lanterns, thin shells of oiled rice paper stretched over bamboo, with a small flame suspended at the bottom. When the air inside heated, the lantern floated upward, silent and glowing, like a soul escaping the earth. Today, we see them at festivals, thousands of warm lights drifting into the night, carrying wishes and prayers. But in the beginning, they weren't symbols of peace. They were tools of war. The story begins during the late Han Dynasty, sometime around the 2nd century BCE. China's frontier was vast, its armies scattered across mountain passes and valleys. When soldiers needed to communicate across impossible distances, they couldn't send riders fast enough or drum signals loud enough. So they turned to the sky. By lighting a small flame inside a hollow paper shell, they found that it would fill with hot air and float away, rising higher than any banner or torch. At night, the glowing light could be seen for miles, a perfect signal flare, silent and elegant. Different colors and patterns were used for messages, one for retreat, one for reinforcements, one for victory. Each light in the sky was a word written in fire. Centuries later, the invention was credited to Zhuge Liang, the brilliant strategist of the Three Kingdoms era, also known as Kongming. According to legend, when Zhuge was trapped behind enemy lines, he built miniature balloons from silk and bamboo, releasing them to signal for help. His allies saw the glowing orbs rising from the hills and came to his rescue. Ever since, these floating beacons have been called Kongming lanterns in his honor. But whether by Zhuge's hand or anonymous Han engineers, the principle remained the same, a simple truth. Air, when warmed by flame, can lift not just messages, but human dreams themselves. And that's how the first flight began, with nothing more than bamboo, paper, and a little faith in the wind.
Picture a grand marble hall in ancient China. Walls lined with silk banners, courtiers whispering, and an emperor sitting on his golden throne. In front of him stand a dozen trembling scholars, clutching brushes, waiting for the question that could change their lives. This wasn't a battle of swords or armies. It was a battle of minds, and it was about to create the foundation for the world's first meritocracy. During the 2nd century BCE, under the rule of Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, China was growing, powerful, complex, full of officials who were often there because of birthright, not brains. Emperor Wu had a different idea. He believed talent could come from anywhere, and that the empire needed to measure it. So one day, he turned his court into a classroom. He gathered his brightest scholars, Confucian thinkers and poets, and began a series of literary contests. But these weren't simple trivia games. They were riddles drawn from philosophy, puzzles hidden in the 5 classics, and poetic challenges that tested both intellect and composure. Candidates were asked things like, "What is virtue when unseen?" or, "If the wind moves the grass, who commands the wind?" Answering wasn't about being right. It was about revealing how you thought. Those who impressed the emperor didn't just win applause, they won government positions. The empire's future bureaucrats were no longer chosen solely by family name, but by eloquence, logic, and grace under pressure. At first, it was just entertainment, a kind of intellectual spectacle for the court. But gradually, these contests became more structured, more serious. They began to resemble exams. Emperor Wu even founded the Imperial Academy, Taishui, to train promising young minds in the Confucian classics. He was, without knowing it, planting the seed for the imperial examination system, the testing machine that would rule China for the next 1,300 years. Over time, what began as a literary riddle became an empire-wide institution. By the Sui and Tang dynasties, these contests had evolved into written exams held in isolated rooms. Candidates spent days crafting essays, poems, and policy proposals. Passing meant power, wealth, and eternal respect. Failure meant obscurity. Families built entire legacies around a single child's exam results. And yet, it all started with Emperor Wu's experiment, a simple belief that thought itself could be tested. That idea changed not just China, but the world. The examination model spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, and much later inspired the creation of Western civil service systems. Modern bureaucracy, in a way, began with an emperor asking a riddle. So next time you're sitting in an exam hall, sweating over a question that seems impossible, remember, you're part of a 2,000-year-old tradition, one born not in a classroom, but in the throne room of an emperor, who once looked at a room full of scholars and said, "Prove to me your mind is worth the ink you hold." When you think of an ancient tomb,
You imagine darkness, dust, silence, maybe the glint of gold. But when archaeologists opened certain Han Dynasty tombs, what they found wasn't silence, it was a flight. Across the curved ceilings and stone walls danced painted figures, long ribbons swirling, robes flowing like wind, faces serene as they drifted among clouds. They weren't angels, they were flying immortals, Fai Shen, souls who had left the earth behind. These murals, painted more than 2,000 years ago, show something profound about how the Han Chinese imagined death. To them, dying wasn't falling into darkness, it was rising, ascending into the skies. The afterlife wasn't a kingdom below, but a luminous world above the clouds, where immortals rode dragons, cranes, and phoenixes, gliding through heaven's winds. The Han Dynasty's spirituality blended Taoism, shamanic cosmology, and ancestor worship. They believed that with enough virtue, and sometimes with the right alchemical elixir, a person could shed their mortal weight and ascend as a celestial being. So when an elite family built a tomb, they didn't decorate it with fear. They painted an escape. In places like Sichuan, Shanxi, and Henan, archaeologists have found these masterpieces still clinging to the tomb walls, women and men draped in silken ribbons that curl like wings, hair floating in invisible wind, faces calm and radiant. Every brushstroke pulls the viewer upward. The painters weren't showing bodies, they were showing motion. What's even more fascinating is what came centuries later. When Buddhism arrived in China from India in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, its artists brought stories of heavenly beings, the apsaras, celestial dancers who played music among the clouds. But when Chinese artists started painting them, they didn't look Indian anymore. They looked familiar. They looked like the flying immortals from the old Han tombs. Same flowing scarves, same hovering grace, same serenity mid-flight. You can see the connection clearly at Dunhuang's Mogao Caves or Yungang Grottos. The apsaras glide across cave ceilings just like the Fai Xian of centuries before. The style of heaven changed languages, but not dreams. It's one of the earliest examples of cultural fusion through art. The idea of flight, of release from the world, passed from Taoist immortals to Buddhist angels, from tombs to temples, from brush to brush across dynasties. The murals also tell us something about the people who painted them. They were content with earth. They believed transcendence was a kind of freedom, and that even if the body stayed buried, the spirit could rise. So when you look at those ancient murals today, you're not just seeing pigments on stone. You're watching 2,000-year-old dreams in motion, dreams that taught humanity how to picture heaven and how to make the soul look light enough to fly. They weren't soldiers. They weren't merchants. They were monks, walking quietly across deserts, dressed in simple robes, each carrying a bamboo staff. But inside those staffs, hidden from the world, were silkworm eggs, tiny, fragile, and about to change the course of history. For more than 2,000 years, silk had been China's most guarded treasure. Soft as breath, shining like liquid light, it was the fabric of emperors. From the farthest ends of the Silk Road, Persia, Rome, Byzantium, kings would pay in gold for a few bolts of it. And yet, no one outside China knew how it was made. To reveal the secret was treason, punishable by death. Silk wasn't just cloth, it was an empire's monopoly. By the 6th century CE, in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian I was furious. His empire was addicted to silk, but every thread came from traders who passed through Persia and India, each charging more than the last. He wanted independence, not just politically, but economically. So he sent for agents of the faith, Nestorian Christian monks who had lived as missionaries in China. They knew the people, the customs, and the danger. Their mission was simple in words, impossible in practice: steal China's greatest secret. The monks set out disguised as pilgrims, traveling the old caravan routes through Central Asia. They couldn't take silkworms, the journey was too long and harsh. They couldn't take mulberry trees, too obvious. So they devised a plan worthy of spies. They hollowed out their bamboo walking staff and filled them with silkworm eggs, cushioned by mulberry leaves to keep them alive. A miracle of stealth hidden in plain sight. They crossed deserts, mountain passes, and kingdoms that warred over every grain of sand. Months turned to years. But somehow, against all odds, they reached Constantinople around 552 CE. When the monks opened their staff before Emperor Justinian, he didn't find relics or scriptures. He found life. Tiny eggs, delicate as dust, waiting to hatch. Within months, the first Byzantine silkworms spun their cocoons. For the first time in history, silk was being woven not in China, but in the West. Justinian's empire rejoiced. The trade monopoly was broken. Factories were built, weavers trained, and Byzantine silk became the new luxury of kings. It was the first case of industrial espionage ever recorded. 2 monks smuggling technology that would reshape the world's economy. But China's silk never truly lost its mystique, its quality, its artistry, the poetry woven into every thread. Those remained uniquely Chinese. The West could copy the process, but not the soul. Still, the deed was done. The Silk Road that once carried secrets out of China would now carry silk back in. And all because a pair of monks somewhere under the vast Asian sky kept walking with hollow staff and a secret worth an empire. In the 1970s, a team of archaeologists opened a tomb sealed for over 2,000 years, the resting place of a noblewoman known as Lady Di. Inside her coffin were silks, food offerings, and medicines for the afterlife. But what stunned the world most wasn't gold or jade. It was a map. Thin silk folded like parchment, covered in black ink lines and tiny red markings. Rivers, mountains, towns, borders, all carefully drawn. At first glance, it looked modern, almost too modern. But it wasn't. It was made around 168 BCE during the Han Dynasty, nearly 300 years before Ptolemy's geography was written in Greece. For centuries, historians believed that the Greeks had invented scientific cartography, that the first real maps of the world came from the Mediterranean. But this fragile piece of silk from a Chinese tomb rewrote that story. The Han had been charting their world long before the West even knew how big the Earth was. The map wasn't a fantasy illustration or a symbolic guide. It was practical. It showed the kingdom of Changsha and surrounding territories, rivers drawn in proportion, mountain ranges arranged with measurable spacing, villages placed exactly where they should be. When modern researchers compared it with satellite imagery, they realized it was drawn to scale, accurate within astonishing limits for the tools of the time. How did they do it? The Han were meticulous record keepers. Surveyors used ropes, poles, and pacing measurements to calculate distances, marking them down with ink on silk or early paper. They relied on geometry and observation, not myth or magic. These maps weren't for scholars. They were for governors, generals, and engineers. Some maps from the same period showed military routes and terrain elevations. Others detailed flood control zones and resource distribution. The empire needed to know where its armies could march, where rivers might overflow, and where taxes came from. Geography wasn't just science, it was power. What's beautiful is how these maps blend function and artistry. Ink flows gracefully across silk, rivers curling like calligraphy, mountains rising in gentle brushstrokes. They're not just records, they're works of art that happen to be scientifically precise. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Greeks were theorizing about a perfect sphere and imaginary coordinates. The Chinese, quietly and pragmatically, were measuring the land beneath their feet. Their philosophy was simple. To govern the earth, you had to first know it. Those early Han cartographers couldn't have known it, but they were among the first scientists in history. Not priests, not philosophers, but technicians of truth. They turned the landscape into information, the first data visualization in ink and silk. Today, that ancient map rests behind glass in a museum in Hunan, its lines still crisp, its message still clear, that long before satellites and GPS, humanity had already learned to see the world from above, not through flight, but through imagination and measure. Picture an emperor sitting in his grand palace, scrolls of war and taxes spread before him, and suddenly, from far beyond the capital walls, a sound drifts in, a song, a farmer's melody, a woman humming while she spins silk, a soldier's drinking tune sung on a lonely outpost. In ancient China, that song wasn't just music, it was information. In the Han Dynasty, Emperor Wu built something extraordinary, the Imperial Music Bureau, or Yue Fu. To most of his court, it was a department for composing hymns, odes, and ceremonial pieces. But in truth, it was something much deeper, an early form of sociology. Its job was to collect the songs of the people from every corner of the empire and bring them back to the emperor. Why? Because the Han believed that music revealed the soul of a nation. If the melodies of the people were bright and cheerful, it meant prosperity. If they turned mournful or bitter, it meant unrest. So the emperor sent agents, not soldiers, not spies, but listeners. They wandered from village to village, market to market, listening to whatever people sang. Work songs, love songs, protest verses, lullabies. Nothing was too small or too crude. They wrote down the lyrics, noted the tone, and reported back to the capital. It sounds poetic, but it was also practical. This was a civilization that truly believed sound reflected harmony in both heaven and society. Confucian scholars taught that if a ruler was virtuous, the people's music would naturally be harmonious. But if corruption spread, If taxes were unfair or wars endless, the people's songs would darken, just as the empire's moral rhythm fell out of tune. Imagine that. Policy guided not just by census numbers or petitions, but by the emotional key of a song. Many of the verses collected by the Wei-Fu survive today, gathered later in anthologies like the Book of Songs and Wei-Fu Poems. They're raw, simple, and full of humanity. A farmer lamenting poor harvests, a young bride missing her husband at war, a traveler describing the loneliness of the frontier. Each is a tiny report on what life felt like beneath the empire's perfection. Centuries later, poets like Li Bai and Du Fu would use the same rhythms and imagery, echoing the voices first recorded by those nameless collectors. Through them, the music bureau's work lived on, turning data into poetry, and poetry into history. It's a remarkable thought. 2,000 years before surveys or opinion polls, an emperor tried to understand his people not by interrogating them, but by listening. He didn't just ask, "What are they doing?" He asked, "What are they singing?" And in those songs of joy, sorrow, love, and loss, he found the pulse of his empire. The first sociologists of history didn't use numbers, they used music.
Not every dynasty is built with swords. Some are built with ink. 2,000 years ago, during the Han Dynasty, one family quietly reshaped how all of Chinese history would be remembered. The Ban family, a father, a son, and a daughter, didn't rule an empire. They wrote it. It began with Ban Biao, a scholar and official who lived during the 1st century CE. He believed that the deeds of the Western Han emperors deserved to be recorded properly, continuing where the great historian Simon Chong had left off. So, in the quiet of his study, Ban Biao began compiling what would become the Book of Han, a chronicle of emperors, wars, sciences, astronomy, and everyday life. He never finished it, but he left behind scrolls, notes, and a dream, that history should serve not power, but truth. When Ban Biao died, his son, Ban Gu, inherited that dream. Ban Gu was brilliant, poetic, logical, and endlessly precise. He took his father's rough manuscripts and began shaping them into something monumental. He organized the Book of Han into annals, treatises, and biographies, giving it structure and flow. He introduced the idea that history should analyze, not just record, that the moral lessons of the past could guide the present. Under Emperor Ming, Ban Gu's scholarship earned him a high post in the imperial library. But with power came politics. When rival courtiers accused him of sympathizing with rebels, he was imprisoned and later executed. The Book of Han was unfinished once again, its future uncertain. Then came his sister, Ban Zhao. Ban Zhao was already known across the empire as a rare phenomenon, a woman scholar in a world that rarely allowed such things. She was patient, meticulous, and fiercely intelligent. When the emperor learned she was Ban Gu's sister, he summoned her to court and asked her to complete her family's masterpiece. She did more than finish it. She refined it, edited it, and gave it the elegance it needed to endure. She became the empire's first female historian and one of the most respected minds in Han China.
In the palace, she also taught the women of the imperial family literature, mathematics, and philosophy. Her own treatise, Lessons for Women, would guide moral education for centuries. Together, the Bon family, father, son, and daughter, produced one of the four great histories of China, setting the standard for how dynasties recorded themselves for nearly 2 millennia. Their structure, tone, and precision influenced every historical work that followed. But beyond the scholarship, there's something profoundly human here. A father's unfinished dream, a son's dedication, a daughter's perseverance. They weren't just writing about emperors. They were continuing one another's lives through words. Empires rise and fall, but the Book of Han remains. Because the Bon family proved that legacy doesn't always come from ruling history. Sometimes it comes from writing it together.
They said these horses bled when they ran. Their sweat glistened red like fire, streaking down their flanks as they thundered across the steppe. To the people of Han China, that could mean only one thing. These were heavenly horses, born from dragons, blessed by the gods. And Emperor Wu of Han wanted them. It began with whispers from the west. Traders and envoys returning from distant Central Asia spoke of a land called Fergana, far beyond the Pamir Mountains, where magnificent horses ran like the wind. They were huge, fast, and tireless, unlike the smaller Chinese breeds that struggled to keep up with the nomadic Xiongnu cavalry to the north. The stories grew with every retelling. Horses that could gallop for days, whose sweat turned to blood, whose power came from heaven itself. Emperor Wu was obsessed. He had already expanded the empire's borders through endless wars and diplomacy. Now he wanted divine steeds, not for luxury, but for supremacy. He declared that only the blood-sweating horses of Fergana could lead China's armies to victory. So in 104 BCE, he sent envoys to the king of Fergana with lavish gifts, silk, gold, and jade, asking for a few of these sacred horses. The king laughed. He refused, accusing the Han of arrogance. When the envoys returned humiliated, Emperor Wu's pride ignited into fury. He ordered an invasion. It became known as the War of the Heavenly Horses, one of the strangest wars in history, fought not for land or revenge, but for animals. Over 60,000 soldiers marched west across the deserts of Central Asia, dragging supply wagons through sandstorms and heat that melted armor. Most never made it. The survivors reached Fergana, half dead but unbroken, laying siege to the city. When it finally fell, the local rulers surrendered, offering up the fabled horses as tribute. Emperor Wu received them like holy relics. He built temples in their honor and composed hymns calling them Tianma, horses from heaven. Only he was allowed to ride them. They became a symbol of divine authority, proof that the emperor's will reached even the edge of the world. But the story doesn't end in myth. Modern scientists now think the horse's bloody sweat came from a parasite, Parafilaria multipapillosa, that caused small bleeding sores. To ancient eyes, that looked like magic. To Emperor Wu, it looked like destiny. The heavenly horses transformed China's cavalry and changed the empire's relationship with the West. Their arrival marked the start of new trade and diplomacy,
the birth of the Silk Road as a living artery of exchange. So yes, the horses of Fergana might not have been divine, but they were powerful enough to make emperors dream, armies march, and worlds collide. And sometimes that's what divinity really looks like. Not in the sky, but galloping across the earth, leaving trails of red behind. Step into Chang'an, the Tang Dynasty capital, year 750 CE. The city hums like a living organism. The air smells of incense and roasted lamb. You hear drums from Persia, lutes from India, chants in Arabic, Greek, and Chinese. Silk rustles in every color imaginable. And everywhere you look, faces from every corner of the world. This isn't just ancient China. This is the world's first global capital. During the Tang Dynasty, from 618 to 907 CE, China wasn't isolated. It was the beating heart of a vast network that stretched from the Mediterranean to Korea, from India to the steppes. And its capital, Chang'an, today's Xi'an, was the end of the Silk Road, the ultimate destination of caravans crossing deserts, mountains, and empires. More than 1 million people lived here, making it one of the largest cities on earth. But what made Chang'an extraordinary wasn't just its size, it was its diversity. The city was divided into orderly wards, some full of local scholars, others of foreign merchants, monks, and musicians. In the West Market, you could buy Persian glassware, Indian spices, Arabian perfumes, Byzantine jewels, and Central Asian horses, all in one afternoon. Imagine the streets, Persian traders in tall caps bargaining in the shade, Sogdian dancers performing for nobles, Jewish families celebrating the Sabbath beside Nestorian Christians carving crosses into stone, Greek physicians debating medicine with Chinese scholars, Muslim travelers stopped to pray before continuing east to Japan. Every language, every face, all moving through the same golden dust. The Tang Dynasty emperors didn't just tolerate this, they encouraged it. Emperor Taizong, one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history, declared that all under heaven is one family. Foreigners were given government posts, merchants were protected, and artists were celebrated. Even the imperial court adopted foreign tastes. Central Asian fashions became the height of style, and Persian musicians performed at palace banquets. Poets like Li Bai described these sights with awe. Camels in the streets, Turkish merchants at taverns, and Western delicacies on noble tables. Religions flourished side by side. Zoroastrians tended their sacred fires, Buddhists chanted in Sanskrit, and Christians built churches, one of which, the Nestorian stele, still stands today, carved with crosses and Chinese characters from 781 CE. It's hard to believe, but for nearly 2 centuries, Chang'an was more connected than most modern cities are today. Goods traveled thousands of miles, so did stories, melodies, and philosophies. It was a living experiment in global exchange, proof that ancient people were just as curious and cosmopolitan as we are now. When the Tang Dynasty eventually fell, much of that openness faded with it. But the legacy of Chang'an remains, a reminder that China once stood at the crossroads of the world, confident enough to absorb everything foreign and make it its own. If you'd walked through its gates then, you wouldn't have just seen a city. You'd have seen the ancient world in miniature, where silk met silver, faith met philosophy, and humanity learned for the first time what it meant to live in a global age. On a misty hill in Shanxi stands a tomb unlike any other. Two colossal mounds rest side by side, the resting place of Emperor Gaozong and his wife, Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman ever to rule China in her own name. Before the entrance stands a single block of marble, towering, smooth, and heavy as eternity. It is known as the wordless stele. Every emperor of China left behind inscriptions carved into stone, long lists of victories, virtues, and blessings. Each line is carefully written to shape how history would remember them. But Wu Zetian did something no ruler before or after dared to do. She left her stele completely blank. No name, no title, no praise, just silence. 3 meters of polished white stone facing the wind. To some, it was arrogance. Wu Zetian, after all, had seized power in a world ruled entirely by men. She declared her own dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, 690 to 705 CE, and named herself emperor, not empress. She ruled with brilliance and ferocity, expanding China's borders, reforming government exams, and promoting scholars based on talent instead of birth. But she was also ruthless. Rivals disappeared. Critics were silenced. Even her own sons lived in fear of her will. So when she died, her ministers prepared to carve a long inscription to tell the story of her reign, and she stopped them. "Leave it blank," she said. "Let later generations judge me." That single act turned a stone into a statement. Historians have debated its meaning for over 1,000 years. Was it defiance? A challenge to her Confucian critics who called her a usurper? Or was it something deeper? A Buddhist gesture, inspired by the belief that ultimate wisdom cannot be written, it can only be realized. Maybe Wu Zetian, who supported Buddhist monasteries and saw herself as a divine ruler, believed her legacy existed beyond ink and language. Or perhaps she simply understood what few rulers ever do, that the more you carve your greatness into stone, the faster it crumbles. Silence endures longer than praise. For over a millennium, the wordless stele has stood untouched, blank, gleaming, and enigmatic. Every traveler who sees it must ask their own question. Was Wu Zetian a tyrant or a visionary? A monster or a genius? The stone refuses to answer. And maybe that's the point. By saying nothing, she forced the world to keep speaking her name. The woman who built temples, rewrote dynasties, and shattered patriarchy left no words behind, only a mirror of polished stone, waiting for history itself to write her story. Even now, standing before it, you can almost feel her presence, not shouting, not pleading, but smiling in silence, as if to say, "You've come all this way just to read me, and still I remain unread."
Everyone knows the story of Gutenberg, the man who invented printing in Europe. But what if I told you that 6 centuries earlier, halfway across the world,
Monks in China were already running their own printing presses, not with iron and gears, but with wood, ink, and faith. It began in the Tang Dynasty, around the 7th century CE. China was flourishing, trade routes alive with silk, paper, and ideals. And among those ideals, none spread faster than Buddhism. Temples were filled with monks copying sacred texts by hand, a labor of devotion. Each brushstroke was believed to earn spiritual merit. But there was a problem. Hand copying a sutra could take months, even years. How could you share the Buddha's words with millions of people if they existed in only a handful of scrolls? So, somewhere in a quiet monastery, a monk had a radical thought. What if, instead of writing every word, we carved them once and printed them forever? That thought changed the world. Monks began carving entire pages of scripture into wooden blocks, reversing every character so it would print correctly. They brushed ink across the surface, laid paper over it, and pressed. Lift the sheet, and there it was, a perfect replica of holy text. The world's first mass production of knowledge. The process was crude at first, slow, messy, easily smudged, but it worked. By the mid-Tang period, Buddhist monasteries were printing thousands of sutras and distributing them across China and along the Silk Road. It wasn't just religion anymore, it was information technology. Then came one masterpiece that still survives today. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE. It was found centuries later in the caves of Dunhuang, sealed away in sand. A scroll over 5 meters long, perfectly printed on paper, each word crisp and dark. The first line reads like a time capsule. Printed on the 13th day of the 4th month of the 9th year of Xiang Tong. That date, May 11th, 868, makes it the oldest printed book in the world. At its front, there's an illustration, a detailed woodcut image of the Buddha teaching his disciples. It's not just the world's first printed text, it's also the world's first printed picture. While monks in China were quietly perfecting the art of printing, Europe was still writing manuscripts by candlelight. When Gutenberg finally introduced his movable type press in the 1400s, the Chinese had already printed for 600 years. They even invented movable clay type centuries earlier, though it never replaced woodblock printing's efficiency. Printing in China began as a spiritual act, a way to multiply wisdom, not profit. And that devotion to spreading truth created a revolution that would outlive empires. So next time you hold a book, think of that monk, carving sacred words into wood under lamplight, unaware that he was inventing the future, not for fame, not for history, but because he believed enlightenment should be shared, not written once and lost. And with that belief, he turned faith into the world's first form of mass communication.
In the year 629 CE, a single monk slipped out of the gates of Chang'an, the Tang capital, under the cover of night. He carried no sword, no soldiers, only a staff, a few scriptures, and a vow.
His name was Xuanzang, and his destination lay thousands of miles away, across deserts, mountains, and kingdoms few Chinese had ever seen. He was heading to India, the birthplace of Buddhism. And though he sought enlightenment, what he found was something even greater. He mapped the ancient world. At the time, Buddhism in China was fragmented. Translations were inconsistent, doctrines tangled. Xuanzang wanted the truth, the original Sanskrit texts, so he decided to go himself. The emperor had banned foreign travel, but Xuanzang went anyway, sneaking across the frontier into the Gobi Desert. The journey would take 17 years, spanning nearly 10,000 miles. He crossed the Gobi's endless sands, surviving on water wrung from his horse's blanket. He climbed the icy Pamir Mountains, where travelers said even birds could not pass. He faced bandits, hunger, and storms that erased entire caravans. But he kept going, guided only by the stars and his mission. When he reached India, it wasn't the paradise of myth. It was a vast living civilization of hundreds of kingdoms. He spent years traveling from region to region, studying languages, meeting rulers, and debating scholars. Finally, he arrived at Nalanda University, the greatest center of learning in the Buddhist world. There he studied logic, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine under India's top masters, becoming one of the most learned monks of his age. When Xuanzang returned to China in 645 CE, his caravan was enormous. 657 Sanskrit texts, relics, statues, and countless notes. Emperor Taizong received him like a returning hero. The monk who had once defied the empire now stood as one of its greatest scholars. Under imperial commission, Xuanzang wrote the Great Tang Records on the Western Regions, Da Tang Siu Ji. It was more than a travel diary. It was a geographical encyclopedia of Asia. He described 138 kingdoms in meticulous detail, their climates, rivers, crops, political systems, and customs. He measured distances, recorded directions, even noted where mountains cast their shadows at noon. Centuries later, archaeologists used his descriptions to locate long-lost cities like Taxila, Kapilvastu, and Nalanda itself. Modern historians still call his work the most accurate account of 7th century India ever written. But Xuanzang's legacy isn't just about data. It's about connection. He brought back more than scriptures. He brought ideas. Through him, Indian philosophy, mathematics, and medicine flowed into China, shaping East Asian thought for centuries. And somewhere between faith and reason, he became something no one expected: a bridge between worlds. Today, Xuanzang is remembered not only as a saint, but as one of history's earliest scientific travelers, a man who sought truth in the language of both spirit and geography. He set out to find enlightenment. He returned, having mapped the path to it. In the middle of the 8th century, the Tang Empire was the wealthiest civilization on earth. Its capital, Chang'an, pulsed with music, trade, and poetry. It seemed unshakable, an empire so vast it felt eternal. And then, suddenly, it broke. In 755 CE, a frontier general named An Lushan turned against his emperor. Half Sogdian, Half Turkic and once beloved by the Tang court, he commanded one of the empire's largest armies. Under the pretext of a false rebellion to purge corrupt ministers, he marched his troops south, not to restore order, but to seize the throne. It worked. Within months, the empire's most powerful general had become its deadliest enemy. The rebellion that followed lasted 8 years, consuming northern China in a storm of betrayal, famine, and war. Cities like Luoyang and Chang'an were sacked and burned. Farms vanished beneath ashes. Trade collapsed. Even the poets, like the great Du Fu, fled starving through the countryside, writing verses about corpses by the roadside and mothers searching for their sons. When it was over, the Tang dynasty technically survived, but the China that emerged afterward was not the same. Here's the staggering part. Before the rebellion, Tang census records counted over 52 million people. A few decades later, those records listed only 16.9 million. 36 million souls gone. For centuries, historians took that number literally. They believed the An Lushan rebellion had killed more people than any other war in human history. And indeed, millions did die from famine, massacre, and disease. But as modern scholars began to examine the numbers more closely, a more complex story emerged. Not everyone had died. Many had disappeared on paper. The Tang government's census and tax systems relied on local officials to report households. When those offices were destroyed, records vanished. When peasants fled the fighting, they were no longer counted. Whole regions stopped submitting data, not because the people were gone, but because the bureaucracy was. Some farmers hid their families deliberately, fearing conscription or taxation. Entire populations melted into forests, mountains, or rebel enclaves, alive but invisible. It wasn't just a human tragedy, it was an administrative one. A civilization so proud of its order suddenly couldn't even count itself. Still, the aftermath reshaped China forever. The rebellion drained the northern heartland, pushing survivors south toward the Yangtze and beyond. The Tang court, once supreme, lost control to regional warlords. The dream of a centralized empire dimmed. And the census, once the empire's heartbeat, never fully recovered. When we look back now, the An Lushan rebellion stands as both a war and a vanishing act. It reminds us that when a system collapses, even the living can disappear, erased not by death, but by the failure of memory. 36 million names were lost, and sometimes losing count is the same as losing history.
In the year 1092 CE, in the heart of the Song dynasty's capital, Kaifeng, a tower stood taller than any other. It wasn't a palace, it wasn't a temple. It was a machine, one that captured the heavens. Inside, water flowed through channels, turning wheels and gears. Bronze figurines marched forward to strike bells every quarter hour. Above them, a giant sphere rotated, mirroring the motion of the stars across the night sky. And at its core, an intricate web of gears ticked with impossible precision. It was the invention of Su Song, a man so brilliant that history barely knew how to describe him. He was an astronomer, engineer, pharmacologist, diplomat, and poet. A polymath in an age that loved knowledge. When the emperor ordered him to correct the imperial calendar, Suzong didn't just measure time, he decided to build it. So he designed the water-driven astronomical clock tower, a marvel that would stand nearly 30 feet tall, powered by an innovation no one in the world had ever seen before. A mechanical escapement. This was the device that would one day drive every clock on Earth, but Suzong invented it first, 200 years before Europe even dreamed of it. The tower was divided into 3 levels. At the top, a rotating armillary sphere displayed the sun, moon, and planets in real time. In the middle, a celestial globe showed the position of the stars. At the bottom, the beating heart of the machine, a water wheel that dripped steadily into a bucket system, turning gears in perfect rhythm. Every 15 minutes, the mechanism triggered a sequence. Doors opened, mechanical men appeared, drums sounded, bells chimed. Time itself came alive. To the people of Kaifeng, it wasn't just a clock, it was the universe, rebuilt in bronze and water. A living symbol of cosmic order, uniting heaven, earth, and empire. Suzong's invention was both science and philosophy. The Song believed that by mastering time and astronomy, they were aligning the empire with the harmony of the cosmos. To measure the heavens was to understand the will of heaven itself. But the story ends in tragedy. In 1127, during the Jurchen invasion, the clock tower was destroyed, its gears torn apart, its parts carried north as spoils of war. The mechanism was never rebuilt. Yet Suzong had recorded everything, every cog, lever, and calculation in his masterpiece, Xin Yi Sheng Fei Yao, new design for a mechanized armillary sphere. Those drawings would survive, whispering to future generations of a forgotten genius. When European inventors began building their own mechanical clocks 2 centuries later, they unknowingly walked a path Suzong had already paved. His clock no longer stands, but his vision endures. The idea that the universe can be understood, measured, and even recreated by human hands. In a world still ruled by superstition, Suzong built something radical, a machine that kept time with the stars. When people talk about the 4 great inventions in China, paper, printing, the compass, and gunpowder, they usually picture science, progress, and empire. But one of them began with something very different. Not power, not conquest, but faith. Centuries before cannons thundered or rockets roared, gunpowder was born in a quiet Taoist workshop, the result of an alchemist's dream. It was the 9th century, during the Tang dynasty. Taoist monks obsessed with achieving immortality mixed strange ingredients they believed held cosmic energy: sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. They thought these elements represented the balance of yin and yang, earth, fire, and spirit. Their goal was to distill the elixir of eternal life. Instead, they created the elixir of explosion. One monk's notes, preserved in a text called Zhenwen Miao Dao Yao Yue, gives the earliest recipe. Take sulfur, realgar, and saltpeter. The mixture may suddenly flare up, burning hands and even the house. It wasn't an instruction manual. It was a warning. The monks had accidentally invented gunpowder, and when they lit it, the air cracked, the ground trembled, and sparks danced into the night. But the monks didn't see a weapon. They saw magic. They stuffed the powder into bamboo tubes and tossed them into fires to scare away ghosts. The noise was said to drive off evil spirits, clearing the way for blessings. These crude firecrackers became a part of New Year rituals and temple ceremonies, lighting up the sky in honor of gods and ancestors. Gunpowder's first explosions weren't for destruction. They were for protection, for celebration, a way to make heaven listen. By the Song dynasty, those sparks evolved into true fireworks. Engineers crafted paper tubes and metal shells that could burst into colors, not for war, but for joy. At imperial festivals, entire cities glowed with light. People believed the fireworks symbolized harmony between heaven and earth, a visible prayer written in flame. Only centuries later did soldiers realize that the same force that thrilled crowds could also hurl death. They began filling bamboo tubes with pellets and fire, the first fire lances. From those, they built rockets, bombs, and cannons. By the 13th century, Chinese gunpowder had reached the Middle East, then Europe, and the world changed forever. It's ironic, isn't it? A substance created to extend life became the thing most capable of ending it. The pursuit of immortality gave birth to modern warfare. But maybe that's the true legacy of invention. The same spark that builds can destroy, and the same curiosity that seeks heaven can reshape the earth. Gunpowder wasn't born from hate. It came from wonder, from human hands trying to touch eternity and accidentally lighting the fuse to history itself. Every time you set a plate on the table, you're speaking a secret piece of history. You call it China, not just the object, but the country itself. That word isn't a coincidence. It's a legacy. Because long before gunpowder or paper money, it was porcelain that made China the envy of the world. Over 1,000 years ago, in the Tang dynasty, the kilns of China glowed like miniature suns. Inside, artisans worked with fire, ash, and clay, chasing a kind of alchemy no other civilization had achieved. They took humble earth and turned it into something that felt almost alive, smooth, translucent, flawless, porcelain. The secret ingredient was kaolin, a white clay found deep in the mountains of southeastern China. When mixed just right and fired at over 1,300 degrees Celsius, it fused into a material harder than steel, but delicate as glass. You could hold it up to the light and see the faint glow of your fingers through it. It was pure, light, and impossibly beautiful, as if nature had been convinced to imitate art. The Tang potters treated porcelain like poetry in solid form. They invented the famous sankai glaze, green, amber, and ivory, dripping over sculptures and bowls like flowing silk. But beyond beauty, the Tang were engineers. Their kilns operated at near industrial scale, producing goods for palaces, temples, and trade caravans.
Porcelain traveled the Silk Road and the maritime routes, reaching Persia, Arabia, and even the coast of Africa. Foreign merchants couldn't believe it was made by human hands. When the Song dynasty came, they perfected what the Tang began. Where the Tang loved color, the Song loved silence. Their ceramics, Ru, Guan, Ding, and Langquan wares shimmered in subtle tones of jade, moonlight, and mist. Each region had its signature glaze. Some crackled like frozen lakes, others smooth as jade. The emperor himself kept teams of potters under imperial supervision. They measured heat by instinct, blaze by breath. It wasn't just pottery, it was precision science. By the 11th century, the export trade exploded. Chinese ships carried porcelain to ports across Southeast Asia and the Middle East. When Marco Polo visited, he wrote of porcelana from China, a name that stuck. Europe's kings and queens collected it like treasure, and for centuries they tried and failed to recreate it. Only in the 18th century did Europeans finally learn the secret formula. But by then the word China had already replaced the word porcelain entirely. Porcelain became China's softest empire, spreading without armies, conquering without conquest. It was proof that a civilization's strength could lie in grace, not force. So the next time you touch a porcelain cup, remember, you're holding not just clay and glaze, you're holding 1,000 years of chemistry, craftsmanship, and culture. A piece of earth so refined that it changed the world's vocabulary and made beauty itself a global export.
Close your eyes for a second and imagine this. The year is 1120 CE, and you're standing in the middle of Kaifeng, capital of the Song dynasty. It's night, but the streets are bright. Lanterns swing gently from iron posts, lighting the main avenue in rows of gold. Vendors shout from stalls, steaming with noodles and sweet buns. Musicians play lutes beside tea houses, while storytellers draw crowds under hanging banners. The smell of sesame oil, incense, and roasted duck fills the air. It's loud, crowded, and alive. This isn't the future, it's medieval China. And Kaifeng isn't just a city, it's a miracle of urban design, the world's first metropolis that truly never slept. By the 12th century, Kaifeng had over 1 million residents, a population Europe wouldn't see until London in the 1800s. It sat perfectly between river and canal, where merchants from the north and south met to trade silk, spices, porcelain, and paper. Its grid-like streets stretched for miles, lined with shops, warehouses, temples, and bathhouses. And the city had something unheard of in most of the world: organization. Every district had its own police patrols to keep order. Fire brigades watched for sparks from kitchens. Street cleaners swept the avenues each morning. Even the city lights were government-managed, rows of oil lamps and lanterns burning through the night to guide late travelers home. This was the first known system of public street lighting in world history. But what really made Kaifeng feel modern wasn't just the technology, it was the lifestyle. You could walk out after sunset and find an entire city awake. Night markets sold dumplings, silk ribbons, perfumes, and poems written on fans. Tea houses stayed open past midnight, where scholars debated politics and poets flirted with courtesans. Bookshops lent out scrolls for a small fee, the earliest form of public reading rooms. And if you got sick or hungry, there were public hospitals and charity greeneries to help you. Art from the time captured it perfectly. In the painting Along the River during the Qingming Festival, you can see the whole world in motion. Bridges jammed with travelers, boats crowding the canal, street performers juggling on corners. It's the closest thing history has to a photograph of a city in bloom. Kaifeng wasn't just rich, it was connected. Paper money changed hands in merchant guilds. Goods came in from India and Southeast Asia. Bankers, artisans, entertainers all made a living in a city built on commerce and curiosity. When the Song dynasty eventually fell, Kaifeng declined and the empire fractured. But for a few golden centuries, it had built something astonishing. A city so alive that even the night refused to end. So the next time someone tells you medieval life was dark, tell them about Kaifeng, where 1,000 years ago the lights never went out.
What if being good wasn't about following rules, but about vibrating in tune with the universe? That was the radical idea at the heart of Neo-Confucianism, born in the Song dynasty, when China's thinkers tried to merge ethics, science, and spirit into a single cosmic vision. For centuries, Confucianism had been the philosophy of duty. Respect your parents, serve the state, act with virtue. But by the 11th century, that moral structure felt incomplete. Buddhism was offering transcendence. Taoism was promising balance with nature. So Chinese philosophers began to ask, what if Confucius wasn't just teaching manners? What if he was pointing to the structure of the entire cosmos? That question gave rise to a new Confucianism, one that saw morality not as obedience, but as harmony with the universe itself. At the center of it was a simple yet profound idea. Everything in existence, stars, mountains, people, emotions, was made of qi, the vital breath or energy that animates the cosmos. And behind that qi was li, the invisible pattern or principle that gives it shape and purpose. Think of li as the code of reality, the logic of how things should be, and qi as the living energy that runs that code. When your qi is clear and flows smoothly, you live in accordance with li, the cosmic pattern. That alignment is virtue. When your qi is murky or chaotic, you fall out of tune. That's ignorance, greed, cruelty. In other words, morality isn't a list of commandments, it's an act of resonance. One philosopher, Zhao Dunyi, described it through the symbol of Taiji, the great ultimate, that familiar yin-yang circle where opposites swirl in balance. From Taiji comes movement. From movement comes yin and yang. And from their endless interaction flows all qi, all life. Later, the Cheng brothers and the great Zhu Xi refined the theory, turning it into a complete system. Zhu Xi's writings became the intellectual backbone of East Asia for the next 700 years. To be moral, they said, was to refine your qi through study, meditation, and mindful living until your spirit became transparent enough to reflect the li of heaven. Knowledge wasn't memorizing texts, it was polishing the mirror of your soul. Evil wasn't sin, it was distortion, like ripples clouding still water. Imagine how different that is from most moral systems. No divine punishment, no eternal reward.
just an invitation to flow with the rhythm of existence. This worldview shaped everything: government, art, family, even medicine. The body itself was seen as a miniature cosmos, and healing was restoring its chi to balance. Scholars meditated not just to relax, but to align their energy with the universe's truth. Neo-Confucianism didn't just redefine morality, it made it cosmic. It said the universe isn't indifferent to goodness, it is goodness, structured into the very fabric of being. So to live rightly wasn't to follow rules, it was to keep your energy clear, your mind balanced, and your heart flowing in harmony with the stars.